President, I want to speak as well today about the budget that's before the Senate, and I want to point out something that I think the senator from New York in his comments failed to mention, and that is that we're actually doing a budget. That's what's pretty historic about this. You know, a few years back, I thought it would be the place where a lot of action was going to occur, where we were going to be doing big consequential things for the country, and so I got on the Budget Committee. Asked our leaders when they made committee assignments if I could serve on the Budget Committee. So I served on the Budget Committee for 4 years. 4 years. In the 4 years I was on the Budget Committee, when the Democrats controlled this chamber, we didn't write a budget. Not a single year. It was like being on a committee that was completely irrelevant around here. For 4 years, we didn't do a budget. And we finally now this year are passing a budget. They did do one in 2009 only so they could pass Obamacare with 51 votes. But the last time we actually had a budget that balances in 10 years was 2001. So we're talking about something that's pretty historic. This is the first time that this has happened in 14 years. Let me repeat that, Mr. President. The last time that Congress passed a joint 10-year balanced budget resolution was 14 years ago in 2001, the year that Apple released the first iPod. And this year, the President has once again proposed a budget that never balances. Not in 10 years, not in 25 years, not ever. And so when the other side gets up and talks about the Republican budget and attacks it, Mr. President, at least Republicans in this chamber recognize the importance of having a budget and putting in place a pathway, if you will, about how we're going to get this fiscal situation in this country in a better place. And that sets out our priorities, because that's really what the budget process does. It says this is what we're for. And what the Democrats have argued, and you heard the senator from New York just making the argument there, is that we're not spending enough, that this is about spending more. And what I would say, Mr. President, I think where the American people are, they realize that if you want to solve middle-class wage stagnation, we talk about middle class's wages being lower, and they are lower. They've been lower since this president took office, significantly lower. You've got to get an expanding economy. The way to help people into a better place economically, to raise the incomes of people in this country, is to getting a growing, vibrant, robust, expanding economy that's growing at a faster rate than the anemic 1% to 2% growth that we've seen here in the last few years. And the way that you achieve that isn't by growing government. You can't grow government, Mr. President, you've got to grow the economy. When the economies are growing, that's how you start seeing people in this country, middle-income families, benefit. Well, instead, of course, as I said, the President proposed a budget that never balanced, and he proposed increasing spending by a staggering 65% over the next 10 years. Now, I don't need to tell the American people that that kind of spending is unsustainable. For too long, the attitude in Washington has been, spend now, pay later. But that only works for so long. Sooner or later, your spending catches up with you. Now, 6 years ago, when the President took office, our national debt was already a massive $10.6 trillion. Over the past 6 years of the President's administration, our national debt has increased by more than $7.5 trillion. To today, it's at a dangerously high $18.2 trillion. Mr. President, that's the size of our economy. That's larger than our economy. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. That kind of debt slows economic growth, threatens government programs like Social Security and Medicare, and jeopardizes our nation's future. In 2011, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, told an audience, and this is a quote, Admiral Mike Mullen, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military official in our country, said, this is what he said, "I've said many times that I believe the single biggest threat to our national security is our debt," end quote. Now, I've heard him say that. I served on the Armed Services Committee for 6 years. I heard the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs say that repeatedly in front of committees at various hearings and at various times. Quite a statement from the country's top-ranking military official. The greatest threat to our national security is our debt. Well, Mr. President, if we keep racking up the debt the way we've been doing, we're not going to be able to pay for our priorities. Social Security, Medicare, national defense, infrastructure, all those priorities could face huge cuts if we don't get our nation on a sound fiscal footing. When Republicans took control of the Senate in January, we were determined to get Washington working again. And we knew that one of the most important steps in that process was passing a balanced budget resolution. Republicans understand what every American family knows, that you can't keep racking up debt indefinitely, and that the solution to being in debt is not to increase spending. So in March, we introduced a budget blueprint that would balance the budget in 10 years and put our nation on a path to fiscal health. House Republicans introduced a similar balanced budget resolution, and during the month of April, the two houses came together to iron out the differences in our blueprints and produce the final document that we'll be voting on today. It's not a perfect document. It doesn't solve every one of our nation's problems, but at long last, it gets us moving in a different direction, Mr. President, in the right direction. Instead of ignoring our nation's fiscal problems, Republicans' budget resolution addresses them and promotes spending restraint. Under our budget blueprint, by the time the 10-year budget window closes in 2025, our nation will be running a surplus of $24 billion instead of racking up another $500 billion in deficits every single year. And unlike some previous budget plans, our budget will continue to balance in 2026 and beyond. In addition to restraining spending, Republicans' budget resolution focuses on cutting waste and eliminating the inefficiency and redundancy that plague so many government programs. Our budget also puts in place reforms that will encourage honest accounting. The result of these provisions will be a more efficient, effective, and accountable government that works for the American people. Our budget also, as I said, makes a healthy economy a priority. Almost 6 years after the recession has ended, millions of Americans are still struggling, and opportunities for advancement are still few and far between. A big reason for that is the oppressive big government policies and deficit spending of the Obama administration. Our budget will help stop government from strangling the economy by limiting the growth of spending and reducing the debt, which would help reduce the cost of work and investment and the cost of starting and growing a business. In fact, Mr. President, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that our budget will result in an additional $400 billion in economic growth over the next 10 years. The Republican budget also will pave the way for the removal of inefficient and ineffective government regulations that are making it difficult for many businesses to hire new workers and create new opportunities and higher-paying jobs. Our budget also addresses another priority of American families, and that's fixing our nation's broken health care system. 5 years on now, the President's health care law has resulted in higher cost, lost health care plans, reduced access to doctors, and new burdens on businesses both large and small. In fact, it's been pretty much one disaster after another. In fact, just this week, a USA Today headline announced, "Contrary to goals, ER visits rise under Obamacare." The article says, and I quote, "3/4 of emergency physicians say they've seen ER patients' visits surge since Obamacare took effect, just the opposite of what many Americans expected would happen." End quote. That's from a USA Today article. And of course, as we know, Mr. President, ER visits are the most expensive form of health care. It's no surprise that a majority of the American people continue to oppose the law. Our budget paves the way for repeal of Obamacare and the introduction of real, patient-centered health care reforms that will give Americans more health care choices at a lower cost. Finally, Mr. President, our budget will start the process of putting major entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare on a sounder footing going forward. Right now, the Social Security Trust Fund is headed toward bankruptcy. If we don't take action, Social Security recipients could be facing a 25% cut in benefits by the year 2033. Medicare faces similar challenges to those faced by Social Security. Under the worst-case scenario, the Medicare Trust Fund could become insolvent by as early as 2021. That's just 6 short years away. The Republicans' budget would help preserve Medicare by extending the trust fund solvency for an additional 5 years, which would protect retirees' benefits while giving policymakers additional time to ensure that this program provides support to seniors for decades to come. Mr. President, I'm proud that today Republicans in Congress will ensure that we have a joint, balanced budget resolution for the first time in 14 years. But I also want to emphasize that that is no more than what the American people should expect. The American people, after all, have to live within a budget. Their government needs to do so as well. Going forward, balanced budgets need to be the norm here in Congress. Washington has spent enough time working for its own interest. It is time to get Washington working again for American families. Mr. President, this budget is the first time in 14 years that actually we've had a conference report that balances within 10 years. As I said earlier, in my time here in the Senate, which hasn't been that long, but about 10 years now, this is the first time, with the exception of 2009, in which we did a budget simply again so the Democrats could pass Obamacare through reconciliation. This is the first time we've done a budget in the 10 years that I've been here. Well, with the exception perhaps of the first year or two when we had Republicans in the majority. But it's time to get Washington working again for the American people. It starts with passing a budget. And that's why I'm proud that Senator Enzi and others worked hard to get us where we are. And I hope that today we'll ultimately have the votes that are necessary to pass this and do something that hasn't been done around here in a really long time, but something that's really necessary and essential for the good of the American people and for the good of this country.